achieve higher and higher levels of realism in painting, which they roughly did about 400 years ago. They achieved photorealism.
Right.
And from that point, art decided, okay, well, instead of going for the external representation of objects, let's go more for the internal representation of how these objects make us feel. And we got things like, modernism, impressionism, constructivism, things like that. So I think games are kind of getting to the point where we can almost put things on the screen that are plenty real enough, to be realistic. And now we're starting to go into realms of artistic expression, a little bit less real stylized.
But if we had the capacity to make truly realistic characters in Spore, do you think that would be more compelling? I mean, part of this is because the computer power isn't there for completely realistic-looking characters, right? If you had it, would you want to make those kind of characters? Do you think you'd stay with...
I would not for a game like this, because a game like this, I really want the players to own the characters. And I think by going to a certain level of abstraction, you're basically letting the player fill in the blanks in their imagination to some degree. It also makes the tools a little bit easier to use. If you were down to like seeing, the stubble on their face, it's incredibly distracting as an author in terms of what you're building. Right. And all of a sudden the level of editing just becomes tremendously more burdensome. So in some sense, I think and also if you look at just kind of character design across, fiction, you kind of have the gamut from things like, Geiger and Aliens all the way to Pixar, which is kind of cute and cartoony, oversaturated colors. And I think, in fact, what we really want is give the players that palette. Not that everything you have to make is realistic, but in fact, they could make Pokemon or things like that, or Disney.
I read an article in Esquire last summer. I think it was written by Chuck Klosterman. He was talking about. He said there's never actually been a work of criticism written about a video game that stands up based on its artistic principles. That all video games or computer games are to this day still basically reviewed like new flat screen televisions. Yeah. It's sort of a little bit, better here, better here. And I'm wondering, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that there is yet a sort of a body of critical standards that allows us to artistically discriminate between video games, or that we're not there yet and it's going to take a while to get there?
Well, I think as designers, we don't have a developed language for talking about the craft of our art form, which puts a double burden on a journalist trying to cover it or a critic.
Right.
At the same time, this is inherently an art form that you have to kind of look at from the inside out rather than the outside in. When everybody's going to see the same version of Star Wars, it's pretty easy for the critic to kind of understand that they're having the same experience sitting in the theater that every other patron is. Whereas in a game, every player is going to drive it into a totally unique space and have a totally different experience. Basically, in some sense, play their own story.
Right.
So it's much harder. I think you kind
of define a set of standards for that kind of experience.
Yeah,
it's so individualistic.
Right. At the same time, it's a dramatic narrative, that's unique to every player.
Right.
So it has aspects of architecture, product design, depends on the time of day you were playing, who you were playing with. Was it a social game you were playing with friends?
Right.
Were you being very creative and making cool things in it? So it's going to be quite a while, I think, before we have, kind of that language for talking about the medium. The same problem is actually what schools are facing, because a lot of students are wanting to come in learning how to design computer games. And there isn't a critical amount of teachers out there that have the experience or the language for them to speak to the students about this as a design form.
Yeah, it occurred to me listening to you talk about the game just now that, we writers have to worry about writing a good book or writing a good article, but we don't have to worry about going out and explaining to people why articles and books can be good, are worthwhile to read. Whereas it seems like part of your job, on top of everything else you have to do as a designer, is that you sort of necessarily also have to be an evangelist for this art form. And I was wondering, does that frustrate you? Would you rather just have done with that and just concentrate on your work?
I think that's a property of the art form being in a very kind of early, undeveloped state, which, is exactly why I find it interesting and remarkable, because there's this huge amount of unexplored space in the medium. But at the same time, people tend to associate games with the reptilian brain. They're about aggression, fear, anxiety. And I think games are slowly kind of evolving out toward the cerebral cortex. And so, but I think, games certainly have the ability to kind of go there. One of the really interesting things about games to me long term is the fact that as you play a game, and this is something that we're doing very early on in Spore a little bit, is that the player's in some sense building a model of what they play. They're playing with a Toy City or a Toy World, Toy Planet, and they're actually building a model in their head, a more elaborate model than they had before. So in some sense, that's the real model we're building, is in the player's head, not in the computer. The computer's just a compiler for what the player's building. But at the same time, we're getting to the point where we can observe what the player does and have the computer build a model of the player and come to understand what you enjoy doing, what your skill level is, what your aesthetics are. And it can actually start modifying the game around each player individually.
The game's playing you.
Well, it's basically evolving to fit you. You know, it's inherently possible for games to start to evolve to fit each individual player, which makes them a wholly unique form of media.
Yeah.
And I think that's like an incredibly exciting kind of aspect of where this might go.
Yeah, that's exciting. One of the great things about your work is that you use science to tell stories. Sim Earth, which is another one of his games, kind of uses earth science to create stories. You talked about astronomy and principles of astronomy in Spore. I write about science quite a bit, and I often find there's, at some level, sort of a conflict between science and the principles of science and doing science and designing experiments and narrative and the need to create stories out of science, because narrative is inherently kind of smoke and mirrors at a certain point.
Yeah, narrative is inherently kind of subjective, whereas science wants to be inherently objective.
Yeah.
Science wants to be reproducible from any given viewpoint, any given scientist, whereas narrative is really told from a specific viewpoint and is very interpretive in its essence. So I think, but at the same time, you talk to a lot of scientists, and it turns out that they approach science, really from deep intuition, and they use experimental data to kind of support their intuition. But really, it's amazing how many of them are guided by things like faith and intuition. And in some sense, in their own head, they have kind of a narrative around where they're going with it. And then they have to support that with external data under real science.
Interesting. Well, I think we're out of time, and I should add at the end, people might be wondering, when can I go and get a copy of Spore? This is sort of like the $20,000 question, but I'm been told the end of the year.
Around the end of the year.
Around the end of the year, maybe for Christmas, we can all have Spore.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks to Will Wright. Thank you very much. Thanks, Will.
Thanks.